Somewhere in a court has O'Keefe in Worcester been Salfani, a sailbox has remained noble for more than years. Instead of the original field notes of a coroner's investigator named Harold Fannock, a man dismissed from his position just 3 weeks after the 1889 Johnstown Flood. No explanation for his failure was verkaf. His notes are refrated the public record. The 17 witnesses they had interviewed before losing his job were never called to testify before an official body. Of those 17, 9 died before the year ended. Note from the flood was already over. On the afternoon of May 31 ST, 1889, more than 1,200 people landed in Johnstown after a dam on by one of America's most exclusive brief clubs Cafu, sand 20 militants of water crashers through the Coma Valley. You've been told it was a terrible accident, the result of negligence, poor in general, and interference. But what the investigation was forbidden to publish sense for more disturbing music than accident. Before we continue with the story of Johnstown as a man who owned the water above it, take a moment to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And leave that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below, music, and tell us what stories you listen from tonight, we want to know how for this channel reaches. Now, let's return to Ben Salfani the spring of 1889, backed a valley that should never have had so much water in the first days. The truth about Johnstown the day was the flood. It was buried quickly, methodically, and with the full coverage of people who had far too much to lose. To understand what happened that afternoon, you first have to understand what Johnstown was, and what it was not. By 1889, Johnstown was a thriving industrial city of roughly 3,000 people, built into the narrow floor of the Coma Valley in the mountains of southwestern Pennsylvania. There can near rusty on all sides, and to rivers, the Little Coma and Stony Creek, confederate at the city's hot before joining the larger Coma River to the west. The geography was intimate and enclosed, the kind of valley that gave a blessed character, a community feeling, a sense of being sheltered from the broader world. It was so mad that a tribe. Johnstown had grown upon air and steel. The Cambrian Rough dominated the local economy, employing a thousand of men who labored in the mills from before dawn to after dark, shabrers and structure beams that built much of the eastern United States. The workers who filled the city were largely immigrants, Welsh, Irish, German, and Cherokee, men who had come to Pennsylvania with an surrounded life in the narrow streets claiming the valley walls. They lived in low houses close to the water. They had little reason to think about water at all, beyond the ordinary flood that came with its brines, the kind that sent mud into first floors of low-lying homes and bust in a day or two. They know, in the world people nothing that chose not to do alone, that there was a dam 14 miles up the mountain. They know it was odd, that it had been repaired more than once, that people sometimes said things about it when their hands were happy. But Johnstown was a city of practical people whose days were consumed by the demand of friends and forage, of raising children crowded in neighborhoods and stretched modest wages across the week. The dam was a problem for other people to repair. And there were, in fact, people who worried about it, engineers who had written letters, inspectors who had field concerns. Those letters and concerns had all reached the same destination, the South Fork Fisher and Hunter Club. The South Fork Fisher and Hunter Club was, in the plainest terms, a retreat for the wealthiest men in America. Its membership list read like a catalogue of Kildage Bader, Andrew Cornkey, the steel magnate, Henry Frick, the cockbearer who would become one of the most hated players in American labor history, and O'Malley, the banker whose family would shape its financial landscape for generations, Robert Bitcar, the region superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and dozens of others, lawyers, judges, railroad executives, investors, music, whose was an accurate represent today. Stacker Bush of the American economy. The club had built the Road Western Reservoir and its dam in 1879, intended to refill the lake that had once sat behind it and create a brief recreation about this mountains. The lake Beres, which they named South Fork Lake but locals called the Club Lake, was thought was best imported from Lakery. There were 16 cottages, a clubhouse, a boat launch. In the summer months, members and their families left baby trail currents benzerders fishing, selling small boats, and then a fashion entirely removed from the industrial or that their investments had. The dam that held all of this, that held the lake, was a deteriorated embankment that had already failed once in 1862 and had been repaired Jubilean, in the judgment of at least 4 different engineers, not quickly. When the club acquired the property, further modifications were made. The discharged people so removed and never blast. This below was reduced in season fitted with a fish screen that regularly cloaked with debris. And the central ridge as the dam was lowered by several feet ila a carriage road to cross it. Each of these modifications reduced the dam's ability to handle large volumes of water. Each was documented at one time or another by people who understood exactly what they were looking at. And still the water rose a freezebrin. And still the club's members took their brief trail course at the moment for another seas. Another the year and residents who were at the property, the caretakers, the clansmen, the men who maintained the cottages through the winter, there was a man named Batek Rafferty, the head groundskeeper. Stockey Isham Hazlat Hamsones. He had worked at the dam since the early years of the club's ownership. Rafferty was not an engineer. He had never attended any technical school. But he had spent more hours looking at that dam than any of the men around it. And what he saw in the spring of 1889 made him deeply uneasy, a way that he struggled to articulate to anyone who might have done it. This spring run that year had been extraordinary. May 1889 was the wettest month in years across western Pennsylvania. There further ran away. The reservoir was fuller than Rafferty could remember seeing. And the water continued to rise. The watches below trickle under the load, shot by the fish screen, water sheet across the top of the road was it had never done before, at least not that he had seen. He sent a message to the club management on May 28. He sent another message on TH. He wasn't entirely sure what he was asking them to do. He wasn't sure they could do anything quickly enough if they wanted. What he was certain of by the morning of May 31 ST was that the dam was covered fire. May 31 ST, 1889, began like most Bernards in western Pennsylvania, overcast, the earth was moisture, the smell of rain already in the ground. By mid-morning, the rain that had been falling for 2 days was intensified rather than easier, driven by a storm system so over the ridge. The streams feeder into the reservoir were run wet. The lake surface, which on summer days was the color of the tan glass, was now a churned crested fence of steadily toward the crown of the dam. Batek Rafferty had not sobbed. He had spent the early morning hours watching the water, walking the top of the embankment there, listened sounds he could not name, a deep, low tremble in the beneath his feet that might have been under a cool off the ridge lanes or might have been somewhere else entirely. The fish screen in this below was hopelessly cloaked. He and 2 other workers had tried to clear it in the dark hours before dawn, whether into the freezer overflows racks and bare hand, and had fallen. The water was coming over the road in a sheet several inches deep and deepen. Shortly before noon, Rafferty sent a young worker, a 17 شرطة out from the village of Southfork named Daniel Coyle, on horseback those men towards the communities in the valley below. Coyle was not the first such messenger that's burned or if that sees. Warren is about the dam had been sent so many times over the years that there was a frozen Johnstown for them, crane of the lake. Most people had stopped listening. When Coyle arrived in Southfork village, he warned the telegraph operator, a man who relayed messages to the valley. By early afternoon, some of the Warrens had reached Johnstown. They were, as they had always been, largely disregarded. At 10 صباحا the afternoon, the Southfork dam fell. It did not fall dramatically in a cynical explosive moment. It fell from the center, in the odorous dams though, the water found a soft bath through the embankment, within the risk was softened, and then simply through. Within 45 minutes, the entire dam had been swept aside, and the lake, a body of water roughly 2 miles long, a mile wide, and in places 10 feet deep, was moved as a cynical mass through the Coma Valley. The wave trapped Johnstown at approximately 4 صباحا the afternoon. It if the note was the sand of water but was the sand of the mount. Surfifers described it as errors that seemed to come from a flower simultaneously, from the current and their atoms, a sand neckernis of the hadhal. Note sender, note ether, but some roder more besloot. Those close enough to see it before it struck described a wall of brown and black mouffer debris, entire houses, locomotives, cars, trees, animals, the compressed material of 14 miles of a bobbilat valley, mouffer at speed surfifers estimated at between 30 and 40 miles per hour. They were struck and destroyed and moved on in a matter of months. When it was over, Johnstown was calm. 1209 people died. Many were never found. Many were found or identified only by fragments of clothes or jewelry. The scale of the loss was so enormous that it overwhelmed any organized response for days. And that interval, in the smoking, the reach through of what had been st, where people began to emerge from wherever they had survived and to make sense of what had been done to them. The relief efforts that arrived in the days following the disaster were genuine and substantial. The numeric Red Cross, in only its second major operation, arrived in their care board, Oderman in Johnstown for 5 months. Many blazed board from across the country and from abroad. The red border of Black's embassy was immediate and enormous. What came more slowly, and what shaped the darker history of what followed, was the cost-of accountability. In the first weeks after the flood, newspapers across the country ran to real scholar for prosecution of the club members and management. The Pittsburgh papers were particularly aggressive. The logic seems straightforward. The club had on the structurally compromised dam, had been, clear the road, owned but is conditioned by engineers and by their own employees, had made modifications that reduced the safety, and had fed the adequate correct fish. 1200 people were dead. Someone had to answer for it. The legal procedures that followed were, in the Dayland Code of the courts, inconclusive. The Pennsylvania courts ultimately found that the flood was an act of code, a phrase that was done for rehearsal, music, in that particular judgment. If that several of the wealthiest men in America had been managers the structure that failed, not a single member of the Suffolk Fisher and Hunter Club was ever convicted of any crime. Not one did $1 in court or the damages to any victim or family. When the club quickly dissolved in the years following the disaster, its members dispersed back their mansions in Pittsburgh and their country houses in New York, largely untroubled. What they left behind in Johnstown was not merely a round city. They left a community that understood, with a clarity that required no legal verdict, exactly what had happened and who was responsible. That understanding settled into the bones of the place, passed from parent to children, shaped the particular quality of mistrust that visitors to Johnstown sometimes noticed in the decades that followed, a reflex of skepticism toward institutions, toward the official fringe of offenses. Toward the man in Pittsburgh who spoke of the disaster in the past tense long before the people of the valley were finished grief. As an underneath that communal understanding, preserved in the memories of survivors and documents that never quite made it into the public record, was some that if the most aggressive newspaper coverage had never fully examined. It had to do with the weeks before the flood, with what the club's management had known and when they had known it. And with a series of decisions made in the last days of 1889 that weren't far beyond ordinary negligence. The man who came close to uncover this was Harold Fanok. Fanok was a deputy coroner from Cambay County, a methodical man in his early 40s who had worked as a surveyor before entering county sheriff, and no built his coroner's work the some habits of documentation and measurement that had shaped his early career. He was not a bibliotecaire. He had no particular connection to the labor movement or to the reform causes that were beaten trish by American civility that are. He was simply a man who believed that the dead deserved a caretaker. Music. In the weeks after the flood, as the official investigations were being organized and the legal machinery was begun with slaughter and todic zonerash, Fanok was conducting his own methodical inquiry. His mandate was technically narrow, to document the causes of death for the victims was in his county's jurisdiction. But Fanok was the kind of man who followed threads over for the lad. And the threads he found in those weeks, interviewing survivors, examining the debris fields, reviewing what little documentary evidence had survived the waters, music, led him in a direction that the vision first cash was carefully avoided. He began to hear signals about the last week of May, about what had been known at the dam, about communications that had been sent, and communications that had not. The official narrative of the South Fork Dam's failure was, at its core, a story of natural catastrophe combined by engineer negligence, a 2,5 meter, a to a dam. This was accurate as far as it went. The problem, a Fennock was discovered in the late summer of 1889, was how far it went. Before we go further, because the story is only cutter darker, if you have it subscribed, now this is the moment. This channel is to tell the stories that the official record buried, the stories that the people was better preferred you never hear. Subscribe. Leave a comment with your series about what this is for club really know. Let's keep going to the politics there. To understand what Fennock was doing and what it demonstrated, you have to understand something about the nature of the official investigation that was run in parallel zone. The Pennsylvania legislature convened a joint committee to investigate the causes of the flood, beginning in July of 1889. The committee included several men with connections to the Pittsburgh financial world, one of whom had business dealings with Robert Bitker of the Pennsylvania Railroad, himself a club member. The American Society of Civil Engineers submitted its own delegation to examine the dam site and render a technical verdict on the cause of failure. And the legal procedures that began the Cambridge County courts in the autumn of that year were presided over by judges who operate within a political culture thoroughly saturated by the influence of the some industrial magnets whose property had destroyed the city. None of this necessarily means that any specific act of occurred. Institutions can fall through the accumulation of ordinary affairs, through the habitual instinct of officials that interpret ambiguity in favor of the powerful, through the reasonable electors of men of middle stature to make powerful enemies on the outcome of their actions, the legal outcome, the official outcome, is likely to be the same regardless. The courts would almost certainly have reached the same conclusions, if the free man on a free committee had been a model of disinterested public service. The law of 1889 Pennsylvania, as it applied to question of property liability natural disaster, was simply not compatible or accountable for the structural choices made on private land, if on those choices could succeed. But Fennock was not working within those institutional constraints. He was working at them, and it said them, in the fall of 1889, a different picture was taken from. The first read he bold was the testimony of a woman in Dickens Driscoll, a widow who had operated a border house in the South Fork village. Driscoll had survived by climbing at a roof, went a nearby hillside, and she had returned to her own property within days. What she told Fennock in a deposition I recorded in his field notebook was that in the 2 days before the flood, she had seen men she did not recognize refer at the dam on horseback. Not the usual workers, not Rafferty and his crew, but men better clothing, men who rode with purpose and left quickly. She had assumed the originals or club officials come to assess the situation. She thought nothing of it at the time. Fennock noted this and moved on. But over the following 2 weeks, he heard variations of the same account from 3 other residents of the South Fork area, a farmer named Josie Curran, who had watched from his upper pasture as raiders came and went along the dam road, a young woman who worked in the club's kitchen had been dismissed from her position early, and a retired telegraph operator named Samuel Bates, who had been the one ventriloquist around the valley, but who was so told Fennock, was Sam. As a touch, that he had transmitted their messages in those fine days, messages originated from the club's property, directed to addresses in Pittsburgh, that had struck him at the time as unusually specific about the dam's condition. Bates could not recall the exact language of the messages he had transmitted. He processed dozens of messages each day, and the flood had been weeks in the past by the time Fennock reached him. But he was clear on one thing, the messages were not routine operational communications. They were urgent, and they were addressed men whose names Bates recognized from the newspapers, men who appeared on the membership list of the South Fork Fisher and Hunter Club. Fennock asked Bates directly, did he return copies of the messages he transmitted? Telegraph operators were not required to keep copies of brief messages in the ordinary course of their work. But some did, out of profession habit or person coach. Bates told him he had written nothing. His logbooks room that be read, which would have shown at minimum the volume and frequency of traffic transmitted the days before the flood, had been reviewed by a representative of the Western Union Company in the weeks after the disaster. That review was framed as a part of a routine damage assessment. Ditz's logbooks were taken for examination and returned. Fanok noted this was at comment in his field notebook, but in his brief correspondence with his brother-in-law, he was more explicit. The Telegraph records, he wrote in September of 1889, appeared to have been made available at his sentiments that would have become most relevant. This was one of the moments in Fanok's investigation where the individual said, each explicable on its own, began to form some that fatlessly coincided some more like architecture. He burst further in other directions. He located a carpenter named Thomas Keary, who had done repair work on the clad cottages in April, and who mentioned enough ways that two of the cottages had been cleared of valuables in the third week of May, furniture most storage, decorative items backed and removed, which Keary assumed was a receded closet. Fanok noted that this was 3 weeks earlier than the club's usual end of season. He found a stable hand named Carol, first name not preserved in any surviving record, who had worked for one of the club's permanent staff, and who told him that in the week before the flood, several of the horses that usually wintered at the club stable had been moved out to Suffolk village, ostensibly for shown. But the stable hand thought it unusual because the horses had just been shot 2 weeks earlier. He located a woman named Nora Sweeney, who had been employed as a laundress at the club, and who had been abruptly dismissed from her position mid-May, 2 weeks before the flood, was one Unsolved is a note of notice. The unusual arrangement that she had assumed reflected some dissatisfaction with her work, though she could identify Nasser she hadn't married. She had been one of 3 domestic workers that coined that some week. When Fanok attempted to find the other 2, he discovered that one had returned to County Cork, Ireland, where she had emigrated from, and the other had moved at a border Hassan town whose proprietor had no forward information. He also, in the course of his work, found some he had not been looking for, the personal journey of a 12 شرطة للشرطة عذكر named Claire Nanelli, who had survived the flood declared a floater section of roof, and who had been was related in Suffolk village at the time of the disaster. Claire's journey, which her mother had tested Fanok after he interviewed the family, contained an entry dated May 29th, 2 days before the flood, that described, in a child direct and analytical language, watching a group of men in cold closer reef at the side of the lake in Awak, stand looking at the water for a long time. They left quickly without speaking to anyone she could see. They looked to read, Claire wrote. One of them kept taking his hat off and put it back on. They left before I could see their faces. None of this was conclusive. Each individual detail could be explained. Cottages got cleaned at all times. Horses got moved for any number of reasons. Domestic workers got let go for all manner of reasons that employers rarely explain. Telegraph logbooks got lost. Many could closer visited properties that hadn't tested door of season of Tesser. Children watched another master reported them. But taken together, assembled in the careful columns of Fanok's field notebook, they described some of that look less like negligence and more like preparation. Preparation for some of that the club's membership knew was coming. The question that kept Fanok awake, that he wrote about an increase of reader language in his brief notes, was simpler than any of the evidentiary details. It was this: if this man knows the dam was come at fall, what did they do about one of the Alfano Matan people in the valley below? The answer, as far as Fanok could determine, was neither organized, neither systematic, or neither remotely commensurate with what their burned understood the recipe. He was 3 weeks into this inquiry, prepared to request formal depositions from several individuals whose names had come up repeatedly in his research, when he received notice that his services as deputy coroner were no longer required. The notice was bureaucratic in his language, as such than as always were. Fanok's position was described as redundant following a report in the county coroner's office. He was sentenced for his service. He was given no formal explanation beyond that. The time, October of 1889, less than 5 months after the flood, struck him as a particular, and he said so to at least 2 people, including his brother-in-law, a printer in a town named George Hadley, music, would like to recall those conversations in some detail. Vi kan take on offer so the real organization that eliminate Fanox بزشوز أي man برنارد كراوز وهاد بنبوينت من 1887 انهلت ذا بوست روزمة شرطة 1890. كاسوز أي ريبوبليك وبورتيلو إلستو سترونتيز ذا كامبريك انتي بوليتيكال مشين which in turn had close relationships with the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Summer Railroad whose regional superintendent was a member of the Suffolk Club. This is not say that Kraft started at anyone's direction, or that any conversation about Fanok referred between men from Force and the county coroner office. The documentary record does not support that claim. But it is note that in 1889 Pennsylvania, political and economic were most battles that did not require explicit instruction. Mamino understood the landscape, understood what was wanted from them, and delivered music. Recede their considerations in the ordinary course of business. Fanok did not immediately surrender his investigation. For several weeks after his dismissal, he continued to work on his own, interviewing people at his own cabins, organizing his notes, attempting to find a newspaper or a political official who might be interested in what he had sampled. This is all the situation began to take its more turbulent shape. The first person to perform was the editor at the Pittsburgh Commercial Gazette, a man named Hobb, who listened to Fanok second, reviewed several pages of his notes, and then told him that the paper was not in a position to pursue this line of inquiry at the present time. Hobb was not rude about it. He was, Fanok noted in a letter to his brother-in-law, apologetic, genuinely apologetic in a way that suggested the refusal was not his preference. He looked at his pages for a long time, Fanok wrote. And then he looked at me for a long time. And when he spoke it was in the tone of a man explained why he cannot so make across a refer. Not in the tone of a man who has said he does not wish it. The Pittsburgh newspapers in 1889 existed in a particular relationship with the man whose name appeared on the Suffolk Club membership roster. Cornicky, Frick, Mayel, and Bitker were not merely subjects of coverage. They were, in various ways, the economic substrate on which the entire Pittsburgh press depended. Their advertising, their political connections, their relationships with the paper's owners, these were not abstract considerations. They were the daily reality of publishing a city that those men largely owned. A newspaper editor who ran a case of investigation to the club for knowledge of the disaster was not simply challenged by Ferman on a Senate story. He was certain his publications access, his publications revenue, and potentially his publications relationship with the political figures whose cooperation with journalism in Pittsburgh possible at all. This was a calculation that could be made in a matter of seconds, without any explicit communication from anyone, by any sufficient experienced editor, music, in the city. Fanok tried to other papers. He received similar responses, late, regret, but movable. At one of them, a junior reporter spoke to him briefly after his meeting with the editor, in the corridor outside, and told him in a office that the paper had been approached in the weeks after the flood by a representative of one of the club larger membership investors and asked, not demanded, asked blatantly in the manner of a request between parties who both understand the circumstances, music, to ensure that its coverage of the disaster focused on relief and recovery efforts rather than on questions of legal accountability. The junior reporter did not know the name of the representative. He had not been in the meeting. He was telling Fanok what he had heard in the office. Fanok then attempted to bring his notes to assembly from the Johnstown district, a man named Robert Cassidy who had been among the most scholarly voices scholar for accountability. Cassidy had given speeches on the floor of the assembly calling for criminal prosecution of the club's members. He had been quoted in papers across the country. He met with Fanok twice in October of 1889. After the second meeting, he stopped responded correspondence. When Fanok called at his office in Hartford in November, he was told the assembly was infallible. Kirk, speaking quickly in the manner of a man exceeded his instructions, told Fanok that Sambim Cassidy had received a visit from servants and that his position had become more nuanced. Robert Cassidy was re-elected in 1890. He did not make an public speech about the Johnstown Flood. In December of 1889, the telegraph operator Samuel, music, bits, one of Fanuc's most significant sources, died of a stroke. He was 51 years old and had been deliberately called health briefly Sotom. The former job seeker had moved busy and as year, his farm sold, his overbets known to those who had known him as a satisfactory. Akens Risker, the board house operator, had left Johnstown for relatives in Ohio. The longest North Sweeney had by that time already returned to her brother-in-law's letter to her Johnstown dress returned and opened. Fanuc was not a man kept melodrama. His brief correspondence, which his family preserved in a small collection that eventually funded so into a Pennsylvania Historical Society, is notable for its major quality, its resistance to the sensation. He was trained as a surveyor, a man who dealt in measurements, in fixed points, in the careful establishment of where suns or relative to another. He brought that temperament to his craft and his restraint. And the result is a correspondence that is even more effective for its restraint than any more demonstrative would be. But in a letter dated January 1890, later his original tone, he expressed some that read differently from the careful documentation of his field notes. I do not know, he wrote, if I am being made feel foolish because it's alone, or if conscience has had some assistance. What I am certain of is that the men who own that dam have a great deal of money and a great many friends. And I have neither. And that this is not a situation which those facts can be ignored for long. I think if the 17 people I spoke with in the autumn. And I can't the ones I can no longer reach. And I keep brief at this number. And I do not know what to make of it. I do not know that there is any source incident. I know only that I keep brief at that number. By this brunner of 1890, Harold Fanuc had conquered. He returned to work. He moved his family to a house in the suburb of Cambria County, away from Johnstown. His field notes from the flood investigation, the 17 depositions, the observer's log, the columns of Campbell testimony, disappeared from the public record. His brother later said Fanuc had kept them to him to keep, but that Fanuc eventually said they were lost in a move. There is another place to this. In March of 1890, a fire destroyed a portion of the South Fork village builder that had the telegraph office, a builder that was contained, in a back room used for storage, boxes of document and office materials from the operations of previous years. The fire was attributed to a stove that had been burned. No one was injured. The builder was rebuilt within the year. Among the materials destroyed, a quadrant, a brief note in a local newspaper's coverage of the inside, or various papers and records of the telegraph storage. What exactly had Fanuc know, and what had been done to prevent that knowledge, music, from reaching the public, is a question that the surface of documents can only suggest and never answer completely. But the shape of what he found, reconstructed from his brief correspondence, from his brother-in-law's later recollections, from the fragments of testimony that have surfaced in various historical collections over the decades, points toward a conclusion that the courts of Pennsylvania never reached and that no official investigation ever examined. And that conclusion begins with a set of decisions made the final days of 1889 at a brief club on a man to be man understood exactly who they were holder above a valley full of people. If this story is already give you chills, share this video with someone who loves documentary history. Hit that like button to help us keep telling these stories, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you don't miss what happens next in Johnstown. Because what the investigation was forbidden to publish goes deeper than any is expected. This is for Fisher and Hunter Club had this last fall meter of the spring season من 26 1889. This is a matter of established historical record. Several members they raise confirmed, and the club's ornament survey for documentation references. What has received less examination is what was discussed at that meter, and what decisions were made in its aftermath. To reconstruct this requires more carefully twin documented facts and the testimony Fanuc collected, testimony that was never formalized, never entered into any legal procedure, and that must therefore be treated with appropriate care. But the pieces, arranged in sequence, form a coherent and deeply disturbing picture. By May 26 the lake behind the Suffolk Dam was at its highest record level. The run for that month had been extraordinary, approximately 6 inches in the first 3 weeks of May alone, was more common. The club's management, including its president and several of its more technically minded members, had received assessments of the dam's condition from at least 2 people with engineering backgrounds, and those assessments were not encouraging. To understand the weight of those assessments, you have to understand what the club's modifications had done to the dam's system origins. When the Comores of Ben Salfani had built the origin dam in the 1846 boat of a state canal system, it had included a system of air discharge pipes running through the base of the embankment. These pipes served a critical function. They let the reservoir's water level be controlled, rather than lower as needed, rather than relying entirely on the supply to handle excess water. If the pipes were opened or below of heavy rainfall, the lake's level could be maintained below dangerous thresholds, regardless of what the weather was done. When the club acquired the property in 1879 and set up a reef of the lake for recreation and use, the discharge pipes were in poor condition. Repair or replacing them would have been costly and would have required engineer work that the club management preferred differ. The pipes were removed. They opened and the embankment were filled. No replacement discharge system was ever installed. This cynical decision, made years before the flood, for reasons of convenient convenience, meant that by May of 1889, the only way to reduce the water level in the lake was through this blow. And this blow, as Rafferty and his crew knew better than anyone, was not equal to the task the weather was now presented. There was a second modification that bore on the disaster. This blow would have been reduced during the club's reconstruction of the site, and a woodfish screen had been installed across it to prevent the base imported from Nakuri from macabre into the downstream rivers. This screen, in the condition of May 1889, was a catastrophic liability. The surging water carried enormous volumes of debris, leaf, branches, faddish from the banks, that lodged against the screen and clogged it repeatedly. Rafferty and his men had cleared it multiple times the days before the failure. Each time, it clogged again with an earth. In the final night before the dam fall, the screen was so thoroughly blocked that almost no water was passing through this blow at all, if as the lake continued to rise. The men at the 26 meter know about the screen. They had been told about it. Whether they understood its full implication in the current conditions the sums of the historical record can establish definitively. But their engineer magazine, and their rural engineer magazine, understood enough about hydraulics and about this embankment to draw their left conclusions. The discharge pipes were gone. This blow was undersized and able to clog. The lake was at its highest record lifeline reason. More run was forecast. The embankment structure quality had been questioned for years. What those facts added up, for a new one will have those arithmetic, was a situation with a very limited range of outcomes. What the man at his meter know, this is the question that Fanok was driven toward, and that the tuition of investigations can so be closely followed, the remedy of research that followed. Not whether the dam failed, which was ultimately an engineering and meteorological matter, but whether the people downstream had any one proportion to the rest those men understood existed. Fanok's notes, as reconstructed from his survival correspondence, indicate that he had 10 testimonies suggest the method of May 26 included a direct discussion of the dam's safety, a discussion which at least one member with engineer of knowledge stated plainly that the dam could not hold under the current and projected conditions. This was not unanimous. Their voices argued that the dam had held before in difficult conditions and would hold again. There was discussion of dispatch workers to attempt emergency repairs on this blow, clear the fish screen, reinforce the road across the embankment screen. There was discussion of what could be done. The carpenter, Thomas Keary, whose testimony about the cottage fallible Fanok had recorded, was so mentioned some he had considered in relate at the time and mentioned only as after so. He had been summoned to the club property on the afternoon of May 26 to make main repairs at a window from the main clubhouse. While waiting the hour for intended to bring him the necessary materials, he had heard through the closed door of what he understood to be a meter from the free suffer man outside the lake a heated stash. I could not make out most of what was said, but heard clearly the words, because, it caused there, and that is caused on, not others. I did not know who said it. I did not know the full context. I had not thought of taking telephone ask him, with the careful bush of a trained investigator, to distribute reason he had seen and heard on his visits to the club property in the weeks before the flood. I recounted to that about understanding of its significance. Fanok, in his field notebook, underlined it twice. The passage that emerged from that meter, or rather, the basis of a passage, is what Fanok found most down. No organization was sent to the community's blow. No request was made to the county or state authorities to evacuate the valley. No systematic effort was made to the Johnstown or the other towns in the Coma watershed that the people on the reservoir had reason to believe it represented mortals. Music. The one action that was taken, send the workers to clear this below screen and attempt to stabilize the road, was taken to lab, and was, as rafties on the separate assessment had indicated, insufficient for the scale of the problem. It was the action of man who hoped, akin to the math, that this situation made to resolve itself was a catastrophe. Instead, a small number of brief arrangements were made. Valuables from the cottages, as the carpenter Kiri had noted. Horses moved, as the stable hand care observed. Telegrams sent to individual members in Pittsburgh, beartly notifying them of the situation and could that permitted, if one chose traded that would, interpretation of normal season cancer rather than a catastrophe. The quiet, efficient management of the club's own exposure to the consequences of a failure that its leadership had reason to believe was coming. There is a phrase in the literature of disaster and institutional failure, normalization of defiance, that was not available at Harold Fanok in 1889 because it would not be coined for another century. It describes the process by which organizations, over time, can treat dangerous conditions as normal simply because those conditions have not yet bulldozed their worst consequences. Every sees that the South Fork Dam held, despite its compromise below, its misunderstood bibs, its reduced embankment crane, was a season that made the next season's decision done slightly, music this year. The men who owned the club had been making these decisions for a decade. The dam had had for a decade. It was possible, genuinely, humanly possible, for me of wealth and education to look at those 10 years and from them conclusions that were catastrophically wrong. But, better than does not sound like the words of a man whose assessment of the risk had been normalized into comfortable distance. It sounds like the words of a man who says the risk clearly, who has calculated the alternative, and who has chosen the one that costs him least. Better zera? Better Alfano attended than a managed, music, failure that proof for knowledge. This is what the investigation was forbidden to publish. Not a supernatural conspiracy, not a secret city or a coded scheme, some more ordinary and therefore more terrible. The logic of men who had too much laws, music, who understood the situation clearly, then chose the rubbish that best protected their possession, and were then protected by law and by money and by the careful management of public memory from any counter for that choice. The legal procedures that followed have already been described. The code finder for code and the survivors. The members dispersed their comfortable lives. The charitable donations that closed the moral account that opened the legal one. But there is one more element of the aftermath that the official narrative has never fully examined. In the years following the disaster, the South Fork Valley above what had been the dam site was quickly purchased. The land changed hands several times through intermediary buyers till it was held by a timber company with no obvious connection to any of the club former members. The timber company lobbied the release early in the 1890s, removed most of the standard trees and was the most of the physical effect of the dam's original construction out of trash. By the time any organized historical investigation of the site became possible, in the early 20th century, the landscape had been so thoroughly altered that many of the specific features described in brief engineer assessments were impossible to locate with certainty. This may have been simple commercial activity, in connected to any desire to manage the historic record. Timber was valuable, and the hell of Western itself were being looked comprehensively in those years. It may be coincidence that the one array of particular relevant to the history of one of America's worst industrial disasters was also the array most disturbed of its physical effects the decade following that disaster. Had Van Ock had still been sophisticated, would have noted the coincidence. He would have written a careful column that editorial comment in his field notebook, and then he would have underlined it. The city of Johnstown was rebuilt. It took years, and it was never quite the same city that had existed before ما 31 st. 1889. The Cambry airworks reopened. No houses went up on the valley floor. People came back, and people stayed, and the city continued as stays though, carrying their losses in their architecture and the particular silences that their subjects built in their rooms. For many survivors, the years after the flood were shaped by a peculiar combination of gratitude and fury that never entirely resolved into either. They were grateful to be life, grateful for the deborah of relief that came from across the country and from as far as Europe, grateful for Clairport and her nurses and the seasoned strangers who sent money and food and clothing. And there were furious, a fury that had nowhere to go because the courts had spoken, the law had spoken, and the men who were responsible had been found, in the eyes of the legal system, to be responsible for nothing. This fury expressed itself in the ways that grief without legal threats expressed itself, in the stories people told their children, in the particular patterns with which certain others spoke, in the refusal, which became a kind of community tradition, to purchase currency style products when other options were available. It was small and practical and entirely without effect on the trajectory of any of the men involved, but it was something. It was the only thing left though. Batek Rafferty, the groundskeeper who spent the last night before the floodwaters embankment and listened to the move beneath him, was Daniel called out the man it was a warrant that risked to let make any practical difference. Rafferty did in 1892. He gave no interviews the years between the flood and his death. Those who know him in South Fork said he was not a man who talked much about that night, or about what he had seen, or about the messages he had sent and the responses he had not received. He done more than he had before. He went massively more and, which he had not always done. These are the accommodations that man make with this another carry. Daniel Coyle, the 17 شرطة للشرطة عضو وزمنت وسزورن, سرفيفة تودج. He gave a Seneca recorded interview on the 19/12 a local newspaper. When asked whether he had done a recent record, he said yes, music, he had a note he was some to do. When asked whether he thought the warrant could have saved more people if it had been centrally, he was quiet for a long moment for answer. He said, there was a team and could have saved everyone. But that team had passed before a road. This as Fork Dam was never built. The lake ran completely in the years after the failure, leaving a broad mud flat where the water had been. Over the following decades, the forest reclaimed. Today, the site is a part of the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, maintained by the National Park Service. You can walk the outline of where the dam stood. You can see the coast of the lake bed in the fagitash patterns of the valley floor. There are all markers and interpret scenes and a visitor center that tells the story of the disaster with the careful, measured language of Shirk Mamarash. It is a quiet place, the kind of place that does not announce what happened there. And the memorial does not include a marker for Harold Van Ock. Harold Van Ock's sealed box, if it exists, has not certain any archive that historians have publicly documented. It may be exactly what the oral tradition suggests, a box of no Roman investigation that was shut down before it could reach any conclusion. It may contain evidence that would, if not, after a century and a third, clarify the degree of foreknowledge that existed in the last music days of man. It may contain more than the documentary treatise of an inquiry that ran out of time and authority before it could assemble its case. Or it might simply be a story, the kind of story that communities tell themselves about their wonders, that if Shaban agency catastrophe, that replaces the unbearable arbitrariness of disaster with the more bearable, yet more radical, narrative of human choice and human betrayal. But her result is not a story. This as Fork Dam was structurally compromised, and the men who owned it know it. And general opinions to this effect were delivered and documented. The modifications made the dam after the club acquired little dust its safety margins and was that exhibit so undebat at the time. In the final days before the failure, the club staff clearly understood that a catastrophic failure was likely. And the communication sent those days clearly reached club leadership in Pittsburgh. And yet, no organized ones, necessarily pushing to the scale of the risk, was sent to the people in the valley below. Whether this represents human negligence, conscious decision-making, or some more complicated mixture of denial and self-interest, the particular moral failure of people who have spent their life being insulated from the consequences of their choices, that question was never formally adjudicated, and never will be. What was adjudicated in this lockout of public memory is something different. The names of the South Fork Fisher and Hunter Club's members remained associated with the flood for the rest of their lives. Cornice's philanthropies, the libraries, the concert halls, the endowments, were sometimes received with gratitude, sometimes with a economies that had those what people remembered. Cornice himself acknowledged the flood only bleakly in his autobiography, that near the end of his life. He did not describe the message to Sharon T. Schmidt. He did not discuss the engineer assessments his club had received. He wrote of the disastrous summits that had happened, that had been terrible, that the community had eventually recovered from. He moved on quickly to their subjects. Frick, was confrontational by nature and made no apologies for her niece, surfif being shot by anarchist in 1992, music, and did 1919. After spending 13 decades accumulated one of the greatest collections in American history, nahasden the museum in New York that bears his name. The Frick collection is one of the finest more museums in the world. His connection to Johnstown is not among the first enough visitors were told. Maila Rosette became Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents. Bitker retired in comfort. Not one of them ever publicly addressed what had been said, or not said, at that last meeting of 1989. The 17 witnesses that had Fanok interviewed the autumn of that year scattered and diminished with that people do. Some day does people day. Some of does people move. The specific cluster of the butchers does and the Solon of Fanok's dismissal may be coincidence, as such as usually are. Or it may be some that the surface documents suggest but can never prove. What the Johnstown Flood asks to consider, what it has always after the official story of rainfall and embankments and inadequate spillways, is what we are willing to examine about the relationship between brief tourists and public safety. Between the men who hold the water and the people who live below it. That relationship did not end in 1989. It has continued in different forms, at different dams, in different valleys, in every year since. The particular man of the South Fork Club long dead. The particular lack the held is gone. But the structure, the dosage, the logic of Beltervera, the beliefs for catastrophe of accountability, is not a historical curiosity. It is a rare feature of had concentrated by behalf on its interests and the public interest come aboard. 1909 people died in Johnstown on the afternoon of May 31 st. 1989. Their names are preserved in the memorial records. Their faces bear in the photograph that survived, work of faces, ordinary faces, the faces of people who had been told by their circumstances not to read at the water above them. Harold Fanok wanted to tell them, wanted to tell their survived children their grandchildren, what had really happened. He did not succeed. Whether he was stopped by the specific actions of powerful men or by the more diffuse with of a system which powerful men really needed directly to achieve the outcomes of preferred, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that he tried. That he spent the autumn of 1989 boosted the ruins of AST, interviewing people who had lost of fleece, assembling a record that no court of received that no newspaper ever published. And that somewhere western Pennsylvania, in order for a could has or the backroom of a builder that has changed several times in the 13th century, the possibility exists that his field notebook is still there. Waiting a seal box in the dark, how the whatever it is that the investigation was forbidden to publish. This mystery shows us some that history has demonstrated can, that the distance between negligence and decision can be very small, en that the man was the better feel that the stas or also the some man was the greatest and test and sure. The said dogs, if it exists, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that official records or some bad people lose interest, and that what a community remembers and what the record preserves or not loses something. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that Harold Fannock found what it sounds like he found? Do you think the better the run account is credible? Or is it the kind of thing that communities in Fantaran are worse than injuries? Do you think the sealed box exists? And if it were open to that, what do you think it would contain? Leave your comment below. We read the free cynical one. And your series mattered how we tell these stories. If you found the story compelling, if you think more people should know what the official history of Johnstown after, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear. Hit the notification bell. And share this video with someone who loves documentary history. The stories we tell here were the ones that did make the final cut of the official record. The ones that got said in boxes, receded, lost and moved, that build the fears that no one quite explained. They deserve to be heard.